The mansion's grand doors swung open with an exaggerated creak, signaling the return of its owner, Richard Blackwell, a 42-year-old billionaire who had spent most of his life building a business empire. He had always prided himself on being in control, not just at work, but at home too. His wife, Abigail, had been away on business for the last week, leaving him to manage their luxurious estate and their 9-year-old son, Aiden, with only the staff's assistance. Richard was greeted by the usual silence of the sprawling house as he stepped inside, the polished floors gleaming under the afternoon sun. He made his way toward the living room, expecting to find his son in front of the television, indulging in his favorite cartoons. Instead, the sounds of music caught his attention, a lively rhythm echoing from the far side of the house, his brow furrowed as he approached, his footsteps soft but deliberate. The music grew louder, and soon, Richard could hear the unmistakable sound of feet tapping along to the beat. He rounded the corner and froze in his tracks. His eyes widened as he saw something that made his pulse spike with confusion and disbelief. There, in the middle of the vast living room, was his maid, Maria, an elegant woman in her early 30s who had worked for the Blackwell family for years. She was standing in front of Aiden, who was clumsily trying to mimic her movements. Maria, with her graceful presence and infectious smile, was teaching Aiden to dance that Richard's mind raced. Maria was a woman of few words, reserved and quiet, but always impeccably professional. He had never seen her act this way, so free, so animated. Aiden, usually shy and hesitant, was laughing with delight as Maria guided him through the steps of what appeared to be a salsa routine. The music seemed to pause in the air, and Richard stood there, staring, unsure of what to do or say. It was as if his world had been flipped upside down in that instant. "Maria, what is going on here?" Richard's voice broke the silence, his tone a mix of surprise and authority. Maria spun around, her face flushing slightly. She had not expected to be caught, especially not by the master of the house. But there was something different in her eyes, a defiance, a spark of joy that hadn't been there before. I was just teaching him a few steps," Maria stammered, her hand instinctively pulling back from Aiden's waist. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Teaching him to dance? Why didn't you tell me about this?" Maria hesitated, glancing at Aiden, who was nervously looking up at his father. It wasn't that she had been hiding anything. She simply hadn't expected to be caught in such a moment. But what she didn't know was that her actions would ignite a series of events that no one in the mansion could have anticipated. "I didn't think it would matter, sir," Maria finally answered, her voice soft but steady. "Aiden has been asking me to teach him something new. I thought it would help him build confidence." Richard's jaw clenched. Confidence? His mind was reeling with 1,000 thoughts. He had never seen Aiden so alive, so happy, so full of energy. The boy was usually withdrawn, spending most of his time with his gadgets or alone in his room. Seeing him so engaged with Maria, it was unsettling. But what truly bothered him was how little he had known about his own son's life. "Why dance?" Richard asked, still trying to understand the situation. That Maria's gaze met his, steady and unwavering. "Because he asked. He asked me, sir, and I thought maybe it's something that could help him feel more himself." Richard's anger simmered beneath the surface, but something else was stirring too. He wasn't entirely sure what it was, but it had the power to change everything. Richard's gaze lingered on Aiden for a moment longer. The boy looked up at him, his eyes wide, nervously biting his lip as if waiting for the impending storm. It wasn't anger Richard saw on his son's face, but fear, the fear of disappointing him. Richard had always been distant from Aiden. He had been the provider, the businessman who saw parenting as a responsibility, not a joy. It had always been his wife, Abigail, who held the emotional thread of the family together. And now, seeing Aiden in this moment of vulnerability, Richard couldn't help but feel something stir inside him. Was this what his son had needed all along? Was Maria filling a gap that he himself had failed to notice? The silence hung between them, thick with unspoken words, before Richard's gaze shifted back to Maria. She was standing still, waiting for him to speak, her expression unreadable. You've been working here for how long? Richard's voice was cold, but not without curiosity. 5 years, sir, Maria answered, her voice steady. I've been with the family for a long time. Richard nodded slowly, processing her words. He had always seen her as just an employee, someone to clean the house, take care of Aiden, and cook his meals. He had never considered her a person with her own life, her own thoughts, her own dreams. But there was something different now, something that made him question everything. His eyes flicked back to Aiden. The boy was no longer looking at him with fear. Instead, there was a sense of quiet rebellion in his eyes, an expression Richard hadn't seen before. It was as though Aiden had found a new strength, something beyond the walls Richard had carefully built around him. Dad, I like dancing, Aiden said, his voice small but firm. Maria's been helping me. It makes me happy. The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. His son, so often lost in the shadow of his lavish lifestyle, had found something that brought him joy. And it wasn't something Richard could control or buy for him. It was something as simple as a dance. Maria watched the exchange closely, sensing the shift in the air. She wasn't sure where this was going, but she knew it was a pivotal moment. For better or worse, her life in this house was about to change. Richard was still trying to process what was happening. Aiden, I don't understand. Why didn't you come to me for this? Why her? Aiden's eyes dropped to the floor, his small hands twisting nervously. You're always working, Dad. You're always too busy. Richard's chest tightened at the words. The truth stung. He had been so consumed with his empire that he had neglected the one thing that mattered most. His own son. Maria, sensing the delicate moment, stepped forward. Sir, I don't mean any disrespect, but Aiden has been asking to learn something new. And I thought it would be good for him. Richard's eyes narrowed, but there was no anger in his gaze. Instead, there was a strange mixture of frustration and understanding. And you've been teaching him in secret? Maria nodded, her expression unwavering. Yes, he didn't want to disappoint you, but he needed this, sir. He needed something that was his own. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Richard felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He had spent so much time building his empire, creating a life that was perfect on the outside, but somewhere along the way, he had forgotten what truly mattered. Maria, a woman he had always viewed as just an employee, had become a teacher, a mentor, and in some ways, a more present figure in Aiden's life than he had ever been. That realization hit him harder than any business deal ever had. I'll take over from here, Richard finally said, his voice quieter than before. Maria looked at him, unsure of how to respond. Sir, thank you, Maria, Richard interrupted. You've done more for my son in these few minutes than I've done in years. Maria nodded, but before she could say anything more, Richard turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the middle of the room with Aiden. Yes, soon as Richard was out of earshot, Aiden rushed over to Maria, his face lit with excitement. Do you think he'll let me keep learning? Maria smiled softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from Aiden's forehead. I don't know, Aiden, but you should never stop doing what makes you happy, okay? Aiden nodded, his eyes sparkling. I'll keep dancing, no matter what. Maria watched him, her heart swelling with pride. She had always known there was more to Aiden than what met the eye. And for the first time in years, she felt a deep sense of purpose. That evening, Richard sat alone in his study, a crystal glass of whiskey resting in his hand. The weight of the day pressed against his chest like a heavy stone. The image of his son dancing, his small feet clumsily following Maria's expert steps, kept replaying in his mind. He had always believed that discipline and education were the only paths to success. Dancing? That was frivolous. Something for entertainers, not for Blackwell. But today, he had seen something in Aiden that he hadn't seen before. Joy. Pure un filter de joy. And it wasn't because of the wealth he had provided or the prestigious tutors he had hired. It was because of Maria. The thought unsettled him. Maria had been in their lives for years, yet he had barely noticed her beyond her duties. And now, she had done something he had failed to do. Connect with his son that a sharp knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, he called. Maria stepped inside hesitantly, her usual composure slightly shaken. It wasn't often that Richard called for her after hours. "Sir, you wanted to see me?" Richard gestured to the chair across from him. "Seat." Maria hesitated before taking a seat, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. She had no idea what to expect. Richard studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I want you to keep teaching, Aiden." Maria's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected this, but Richard continued, leaning forward, under one condition. "I want to be involved." Maria blinked in surprise. "You want to learn too?" Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "No, not me. I just want to know what you're teaching him. I don't want my son wasting time on something meaningless." Maria's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her composure. "Sir, if I may, dancing isn't meaningless. It teaches discipline, confidence, expression. Aiden is discovering himself through it." Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by an employee. But there was something about Maria's conviction that made it difficult to argue. "You really believe that?" he asked. Maria met his gaze. "Yes, I do. And more importantly, Aiden believes it." The words settled between them like a quiet revelation. Richard ran a hand through his hair. "Fina, keep teaching him. But if I see any signs that it's distracting him from his studies, it stops immediately." Maria nodded, her heart still pounding. She hadn't expected Richard to be open to this at all. "I understand," she said. Richard gave a small nod. "That's all. You can go." Maria stood, but before she reached the door, she turned back. "Mr. Blackwell?" Richard looked up. "Maybe instead of watching from a distance, you could try dancing with him. Just once." Richard scoffed. "That won't happen." Maria smiled knowingly. "We'll see." And with that, she left the room, leaving Richard to ponder the one thing he had never considered before. What if he had been wrong all along? Aiden could hardly believe it. His father hadn't shut down his dancing. In fact, he was letting him continue. That alone was a victory. But what surprised him even more was that Richard was now watching his lessons closely. Every evening after work, Richard would stand at the edge of the dance studio, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Maria continued to teach Aiden, but she could feel the weight of Richard's presence in the room. Aiden, on the other hand, was thriving. His movements became more fluid, his steps more confident. He was a natural, and Maria couldn't help but feel proud. But despite Aiden's progress, Richard remained silent, observing like a man inspecting an investment he wasn't sure would pay off. One evening, after an intense session, Aiden ran up to his father, breathless and excited. "Dad, did you see that? I finally got the spin right." Richard nodded. "I saw." Aiden grinned. "Maria says I'm improving fast. You should try it with me." Richard chuckled dryly. "I don't dance, son." Aiden's smile faltered. "Why not?" Richard hesitated. He could have given a dozen excuses. He was too busy, too old, too dignified. But the truth was he was afraid. Afraid of looking foolish. Afraid of stepping into a world he didn't understand. Maria, sensing the moment, stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwell, everyone can dance. It's just about letting go." Richard scoffed. "I don't let go, Maria. I control." Maria tilted her head. "And how's that working out for you?" Richard narrowed his eyes at her, but there was no malice in his gaze, just curiosity. Aiden grabbed his father's hand. "Come on, Dad. Just one step." Richard sighed. The room was silent, all eyes on him. For the first time in years, he felt out of his depth. But then he looked down at Aiden, his son's hopeful face staring up at him. And against every instinct in his body, Richard took a step forward. Maria smiled. "All right, Mr. Blackwell, let's begin." Richard stood stiffly in the middle of the dance floor, his shoulders tense and his hands awkwardly at his sides. He had faced boardrooms full of cutthroat investors, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and commanded respect with nothing more than his presence. But standing here, waiting for Maria's instruction, he felt completely out of his element. Aiden bounced with excitement beside him. "This is going to be so cool, Dad." Maria clapped her hands together, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "All right, Mr. Blackwell, let's start with something simple. Just a basic step. Follow me." She moved gracefully, stepping forward with her right foot, then back with her left, her body flowing effortlessly to the rhythm of the soft music playing in the background. Aiden mimicked her with ease. Richard, however, barely moved. His feet felt like lead. He cleared his throat. I don't see how this is supposed to be beneficial. Maria chuckled. It's not about seeing, it's about feeling. Try again. Richard inhaled sharply and took a hesitant step forward, then back. His movements were stiff, mechanical. He was a man used to control, but here, there were no numbers, no logic to rely on. Aiden nudged him. Loosen up, Dad. Richard sighed. I am loose. Maria smirked. That's the most rigid loose I've ever seen. Aiden giggled, and for the first time, Richard felt a crack in his usual stern exterior. He glanced at his son, who was laughing freely, completely unburdened by the pressures of perfection. For a moment, Richard envied him. Maria stepped closer. Dancing isn't about getting it perfect. It's about letting yourself be in the moment. Trusting the rhythm. Richard frowned. Trust wasn't something that came easily to him. But then he looked at Aiden again, his son, who had struggled to connect with him for so long. Now watching him with hopeful eyes, something inside Richard shifted. He exhaled and tried again, this time not overthinking it. He stepped forward, then back, allowing himself to follow Maria's lead. It was clumsy, awkward, but it was a step. Maria smiled. Now that's more like it. Aiden cheered. You did it, Dad. Richard smirked, shaking his head. Barely. Maria folded her arms. Barely is still progress. Richard didn't say it out loud, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar, a strange lightness, and he wasn't sure if it was from dancing or from finally letting go, even just a little. Over the next few days, Richard continued his hesitant attempts at dancing. At first, he only practiced when Maria and Aiden insisted, but something unexpected happened. He started to enjoy IT. IT wasn't just the steps. It was the freedom, the release. The fact that for a few minutes, he wasn't the untouchable billionaire or the perfection-obsessed businessman. He was just a man learning something new alongside his son. Maria, ever patient, guided him with small corrections. Relax your shoulders. Richard exhaled, rolling them back. Stop looking at your feet. Feel the movement. He lifted his chin, his expression torn between amusement and frustration. Trust me, that was the hardest part. One evening, after an intense session, Aiden ran off to grab some water, leaving Richard and Maria alone in the quiet studio. Maria wiped her hands on her skirt and turned to him. You're getting better. Richard chuckled. That's a very generous assessment. Maria studied him for a moment. You know, I never thought I'd see the day when Richard Blackwell willingly danced. Richard smirked. Neither did I. She tilted her head. What changed? Richard sighed, glancing toward the door where Aiden had left. He did. Maria nodded. You're a good father. Richard scoffed. You don't have to flatter me, Maria. I'm not. Her voice was firm. You could have shut this down the moment you saw Aiden dancing. But you didn't. That says something. Richard held her gaze, an unfamiliar warmth settling between them. Before he could respond, Aiden came running back, breaking the moment. Okay, can we try the full routine now? Maria clapped her hands. Let's do it. As the music started again, Richard took his place. And for the first time, he didn't feel like a man out of place. He felt like a father finally stepping into his son's world. The days turned into weeks, and something remarkable began to unfold in the Blackwell mansion. Every evening, without fail, Richard showed up to dance. He no longer needed coaxing. He was there because he wanted to be, because it had become more than just movement. It was a bridge between him and Aiden, a language they had never spoken before. Maria noticed the shift too. The once cold and distant billionaire was changing, though he probably didn't realize it himself. He laughed more, his posture was less rigid, and the walls he had built around himself were beginning to crack. One night, after an intense practice session, Richard slumped onto the couch in the studio, exhausted but satisfied. Aiden flopped down beside him, grinning. That was awesome, Dad. Richard chuckled, running a hand through his hair. I don't know about awesome, but I didn't fall on my face this time, so I'll take it. Aiden giggled, then suddenly sat up, his expression turning serious. "Hey, Dad." Richard glanced at him. "Yeah." Aiden hesitated for a moment before saying, "I'm really happy you're doing this with me." Richard's chest tightened. He had always thought that providing for his son meant giving him the best education, the best opportunities, the best life. But he was only now realizing that what Aiden needed most was something much simpler: his time, his presence. He placed a hand on Aiden's shoulder and gave it a squeeze. "Me too, buddy." Maria, who had been watching from the doorway, felt a lump form in her throat. She had never imagined that teaching Aiden to dance would lead to this, that would heal a relationship that had been broken for so long. Richard met her gaze, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. A quiet acknowledgement, a thank you. Maria smiled, nodding slightly before turning away, giving them their moment. But as she walked down the hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that something even bigger was happening, something she hadn't seen coming. The Blackwell mansion was usually a place of quiet formality, but tonight, it buzzed with an unfamiliar energy. Aiden had convinced Richard to attend a small dance showcase at his school. Nothing grand, just a gathering of parents and students where each child would perform a routine they had been working on. Initially, Richard had been hesitant. "Do I have to?" he had asked, adjusting his tie that morning. Aiden had given him a look. "Dad, we've been practicing for weeks. You can't back out now." Richard had sighed, but deep down, he knew there was no way he was saying no. Now, as he stood backstage, waiting for their turn, Richard's palms were sweating. He had stood in front of thousands of people before, shareholders, press conferences, entire boardrooms hanging onto his every word. And yet, standing here, about to dance in front of a small audience, he felt more nervous than he ever had in his life. Maria, sensing his tension, stepped up beside him. "Relax, Mr. Blackwell." Richard exhaled sharply. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one who might embarrass himself in front of 100 people. Maria smirked. 100 people who are all just parents and kids. No billionaires, no investors, just families. Richard turned to her, his expression softening. "That's exactly why this matters more." Maria's gaze lingered on him for a moment. "Then stop thinking like a CEO and start thinking like a father." Richard let out a small chuckle. "You have an annoying way of always being right." Maria grinned. "It's a gift." The announcer's voice rang through the auditorium. Next up, we have Aiden Blackwell and his father, Richard Blackwell, performing a special father-son routine. The crowd clapped politely. Richard took a deep breath, glancing down at Aiden, who was practically vibrating with excitement. "You ready, Dad?" Richard nodded. "Let's do this." As the music started, he stepped onto the stage, his heart pounding. The moment he took his first step, the nerves melted away. Because for the first time in his life, Richard Blackwell wasn't thinking about how he looked. He wasn't thinking about perfection. He was just there in the moment with his son, and that was all that mattered. As the first beats of the music echoed through the auditorium, Richard forced himself to focus. Aiden moved with ease, his steps light and fluid. Richard, on the other hand, was more rigid, but he was keeping up. The crowd watched in stunned silence at first, not expecting the famously stiff and businesslike billionaire to be dancing in front of them. But as the routine progressed, the energy in the room shifted. Murmurs of surprise turned into smiles, and then into cheers. Richard and Aiden moved in perfect sync, the routine a mixture of fun, playful steps and moments of undeniable connection. Maria had crafted the choreography in a way that showcased not just the dance, but the bond between father and son. Then, as the routine reached its climax, Richard did something that shocked everyone, including himself. Instead of merely following Aiden's lead, he let go. He moved without overthinking, letting the music guide him. His usually stiff posture melted into something looser, freer. And in that moment, he wasn't Richard Blackwell, the billionaire businessman, that he was just a dad, dancing with his son. When the routine ended, the auditorium erupted into applause. Parents, teachers, and students alike stood up, clapping and cheering. Aiden turned to his father, beaming. "Dad, that was amazing." Richard, slightly breathless, looked down at his son and chuckled. "I didn't fall. That's the real victory. Maria was standing off to the side, hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes shining with pride. She had known Richard was capable of this, but seeing it happen, seeing him break out of his shell, was something else entirely. As the applause finally died down, a few parents even approached Richard, congratulating him on the performance. "I had no idea you could dance," one father said with a grin. "Neither did I," Richard admitted, running a hand through his hair. Just then, Maria walked up to them, still smiling. "I'm impressed, Mr. Blackwell. You actually let go out there." Richard turned to her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, he said something that surprised even himself. "It's because I had a great teacher." Maria blinked, caught off guard. There was something different in his tone, something genuine, something soft. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink around them, the cheers of the crowd fading into the background. But before anything more could be said, Aiden interrupted. "Can we celebrate with ice cream?" Richard chuckled. "You earned it, buddy." He then turned to Maria. "Join us." Maria hesitated, then smiled. "I'd love to." As they walked out together, Richard felt something shift within him. For the first time in years, his life wasn't just about work and expectations. For the first time, he was truly living. The ice cream parlor was a far cry from the high-end restaurants Richard was used to, but tonight, it felt perfect. It was cozy, filled with families laughing and chatting, the scent of freshly made waffle cones filling the air. Aiden excitedly browsed the flavors before choosing a ridiculous mix of chocolate, marshmallows, and gummy bears. Richard, after much persuasion from his son, went for a classic vanilla with caramel drizzle. Maria, always adventurous, picked mango sorbet as they sat at a corner table. Aiden dove into his ice cream, happily oblivious to the unspoken tension between his father and Maria. Richard found himself glancing at her more than necessary, noticing things he hadn't before. The way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, how her fingers twirled her spoon absent-mindedly. Halfway through his dessert, Aiden suddenly grinned. "Dad, I think Miss Maria is your lucky charm." Maria nearly choked on her sorbet. "Excuse me?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "What do you figure?" "Well," Aiden said matter-of-factly, "before she came, you didn't dance. You didn't laugh much. And you definitely didn't eat ice cream with gummy bears." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "So you're saying Maria changed me?" Aiden nodded, licking his spoon. "Yup, and I think that's a good thing." Maria, suddenly feeling warm, focused on her dessert. "Aiden, your dad was always capable of this. He just needed a little push." Richard studied her for a moment. "And you were the one who gave it to me." Maria looked up, their eyes locking. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. There was something there, something unspoken but undeniable. Maria was the first to break the moment, clearing her throat. "Well, if that's true, then my job here is done." Richard frowned slightly. "Is it?" Maria hesitated. "Aiden's got the confidence now. You two have reconnected. I'd say my role is complete." Aiden's face fell. "Wait, does that mean you're leaving?" Maria bit her lip. "Well, I was only hired to help with the dancing." Aiden turned to his father, eyes wide with pleading. "Dad, tell her she has to stay." Richard's jaw tightened. He hadn't considered what would happen when Maria left. But now, the thought of her walking away unsettled him in a way he wasn't ready to admit. Before he could respond, Maria smiled at Aiden. "We'll see, buddy." But deep down, she wasn't sure if staying was even an option. Because what she felt right now, this connection with Richard, it was dangerous. And if she wasn't careful, it would change everything. Later that night, after dropping Maria off at her apartment, Richard drove home in silence, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Aiden had fallen asleep in the back seat, his head resting against the window, his face still lit with the joy of the night. Richard couldn't remember the last time he had seen his son this happy, this carefree, and he knew exactly who to thank for it. Maria, she had done more than teach Aiden to dance. She had brought something into their lives that had been missing for a long time. Warmth, connection, joy. Richard pulled into the Blackwell estate, carrying Aiden inside and tucking him in a bed. As he brushed a hand over his son's hair, a thought struck him. He didn't want Maria to leave. IT wasn't just about Aiden, IT was about him, too. Maria had become a part of their world, and the idea of losing her now felt wrong. But what could he do? He was her employer. She was his son's dance teacher. And whatever emotions were brewing between them, it wasn't supposed to happen. Still, as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, one thing became painfully clear: he couldn't ignore this anymore. The next morning, Richard found himself standing outside Maria's apartment. He had no plan, no rehearsed speech, just a growing realization that he needed to see her. When she opened the door, she looked surprised. "Mr. Blackwell?" Richard exhaled sharply. "Can we talk?" Maria hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." The apartment was small but cozy, nothing like the grand estate he was used to. A bookshelf overflowing with novels sat by the window, and the faint scent of vanilla lingered in the air. It suited her. Richard took a deep breath, not sure how to start. "About last night," Maria folded her arms. "I figured this was coming." He frowned. "You did?" She nodded. "You're here to tell me it was all a mistake, right? That I overstepped? That I shouldn't have gotten so involved?" Richard blinked, caught off guard. "No." Maria's expression shifted. "No." He shook his head. "Maria, you didn't overstep. If anything, you did more for Aiden than I ever could have." Maria's eyes softened. "Richard," he ran a hand through his hair. "And it's not just about Aiden. It's about me too." He hesitated, then looked at her directly. "You changed something in me, Maria, and I don't know what to do about it." Silence filled the room. Maria's heart pounded. She had felt it too, this undeniable pull between them. But she also knew how complicated this was. "You're Aiden's father," she said softly, "and I'm his teacher. If we cross this line..." Richard took a step closer. "Tell me you don't feel it." Maria swallowed hard. She couldn't, because she did. She had been fighting it from the start, but the truth was Richard Blackwell had found a way into her heart, and she didn't know how to stop it. Maria took a deep breath, stepping back slightly, trying to put distance between them. Her heart was racing, her mind screaming at her to be careful. "Richard," she said cautiously, "this isn't just about what we feel. This is about Aiden, your reputation, your entire world. If people found out, I don't care what people think." His voice was firm, his gaze locked onto hers. "For once in my life, I don't want to make a decision based on what's expected of me. I just want to do what feels right." Maria's breath hitched. "And what feels right?" He took another step closer. "You." The weight of his words settled between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Maria wanted to believe him. She wanted to give in to the pull that had been growing between them from the moment they met. But reality wasn't that simple. She shook her head. "It's not just about feelings, Richard. You're a billionaire, and I'm the woman who changed my life." He interrupted. Maria's chest tightened. "That doesn't erase the complications." Richard studied her, then exhaled slowly. "I'm not asking for answers right now. I just needed you to know." Maria's eyes searched his, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to imagine it. The possibility of something real, something more. But before she could say another word, a knock at the door shattered the moment. Maria turned, frowning. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, her stomach dropped. Standing there was none other than Victoria Lancaster, Aiden's school principal and one of the most influential women in their social circle. And a look on her face said she had seen more than she should have. Victoria crossed her arms, glancing between Maria and Richard. "Well, isn't this an interesting surprise?" Maria's heart pounded. "Ms. Lancaster, what are you doing here?" Victoria's lips curled into a knowing smirk. "I was just in the neighborhood when I spotted Mr. Blackwell's car parked outside. Imagine my curiosity when I saw him enter." Richard's jaw tightened. "Is there a point to this visit, Victoria?" "Oh, no need to get defensive, Richard." She tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with unspoken judgment. "I just find it fascinating that the city's most powerful businessman is paying a visit to his son's dance teacher. Alone, in her apartment." Maria swallowed hard. She knew how quickly rumors spread in their world. And if Victoria decided to twist the story, it could ruin everything. Not just for Maria, but for Aiden. Richard's voice was cool but firm. "Whatever you're implying, I suggest you stop." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I'm not implying anything. But I do wonder how people would react if they knew the esteemed Richard Blackwell was entangled with his maid-turned-dance instructor. Maria flinched. She hated the way Victoria said it, like she was nothing, like she didn't belong. Richard stepped forward, his voice dangerously low. You have no right to meddle in my personal life. Victoria Smirkev. Maybe not, but I do have a duty to uphold certain standards. Aiden's school is built on tradition, Richard. What kind of example would this set? Maria's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about gossip. This was a threat, and they both knew it. Maria's fingers clenched at her sides as the weight of Victoria's words settled in. This wasn't just idle gossip. This was a threat wrapped in polished words and fake concern. If Victoria spread this rumor, it wouldn't just hurt Maria's reputation. It could affect Aiden. It could force Richard to choose between his son and her. Richard's jaw tightened. Victoria, if you think you can manipulate me, oh, I don't need to manipulate you, Victoria said smoothly. I'm simply stating the obvious. If word gets out that the great Richard Blackwell is having an affair with his son's dance instructor, the consequences won't be pretty. The parents at Aiden's school will talk. Investors will whisper. And worst of all, Aiden will be the one caught in the middle. Maria felt a cold chill run down her spine. Victoria was right about one thing. Aiden would suffer the most. Kids were cruel. The parents in their social circles were worse. If this became a scandal, Aiden would be the one paying the price. Maria swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet Richard's gaze. She's right, she said quietly. His head snapped toward her. Maria, she shook her head. Aiden doesn't deserve this. He's finally happy, Richard. I won't be the reason that's taken away from him. Victoria smirked, clearly satisfied with Maria's reaction. A wise choice, she said. I suggest you stick to it. Then, with one last glance at Richard, she turned on her heel and walked away, her high heels clicking against the floor like the final nails in a coffin. Maria exhaled shakily, her heart pounding. Richard reached for her, his touch warm on her arm. Maria, don't listen to her. She's just trying to control us. Maria's eyes burned. It doesn't matter if she's trying to control us. It matters that she can. She pulled away, her voice shaking. I should have known this was impossible. Richard's eyes darkened. So what are you saying? She forced herself to take a steadying breath. I'm saying maybe it's best if I quit. Richard stiffened. No, Maria bit her lip. Richard, no, he repeated, his voice firm. You're not quitting because of her. Maria's chest ached. This isn't about Victoria. It's about Aiden. I can't let him become the target of rumors and whispers because of me. Richard ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. So, you're just going to walk away? What choice do I have? She whispered. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Maria wished he would tell her there was another way. But they could fight this. That love was enough. But they both knew that wasn't how the world worked. After a long pause, Richard exhaled sharply. If that's what you want, his voice was tight, controlled. Then I won't stop you. Maria's heart clenched. She had expected him to fight harder. She had wanted him to fight harder. But this was what was best for Aiden. For all of them as she swallowed the pain, threatening to crush her, and nodded. I'll tell Aiden tonight. Richard didn't respond. He simply turned and walked out of her apartment. And with every step he took away from her, Maria felt her heart shatter into pieces. Maria stood outside the Blackwell estate that evening, her hands trembling as she prepared to face Aiden. This was going to break his heart. She had rehearsed the words in her head 100 times, trying to find a way to soften the blow. But no matter how she phrased it, it all led to the same crushing truth. She was leaving. She rang the doorbell, and within seconds, Aiden came running down the grand hallway, his face lighting up. Maria, he threw his arms around her waist. You're here. I've been practicing that new step you taught me. Want to see? Maria swallowed the lump in her throat. She crouched to his level, brushing a hand over his dark curls. Aiden, sweetheart, we need to talk. The joy in his eyes flickered with uncertainty. What's wrong? She forced herself to smile, but it wobbled. I have to go away for a while. His little face scrunched in confusion. Go away? But why? Did I do something wrong? Maria's heart twisted painfully. No, Aiden. You did nothing wrong. You're amazing. It's just sometimes grown-ups have to make tough choices. Aiden shook his head, his eyes shining with unshed tears. But you promised you'd always teach me. You said we'd practice for the recital together. Maria's breath hitched. She had promised, but some promises had to be broken. I know, sweetheart, she whispered, cupping his cheeks. And I wish things were different. Aiden's lips trembled. Is this because of my dad? Did he make you leave? Maria hesitated. No, your dad. He cares about you so much. And he only wants what's best for you. Aiden sniffled. Then why is he letting you go? Maria had no answer to that, because she was wondering the same thing. Richard stood by the window of his office, watching Maria's car drive away. He had told himself letting her go was the right thing to do. That protecting Aiden from scandal was more important than his own happiness. Then why did it feel like he had just made the worst mistake of his life? A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts that it was Aiden. His son stood there, his little fists clenched at his sides, his eyes red from crying that Richard's chest tightened. Aiden, why did you let her leave? Aiden's voice was small, but the pain in it was enormous. Richard swallowed hard. It's complicated, son. Aiden shook his head violently. No, it's not. You love her. I know you do. Richard's breath caught. He had never said those words aloud, not even to himself, but hearing them from Aiden made them real. Aiden sniffled. She made you happy. She made me happy. And now she's gone. And it's all your fault. Richard felt like he had been punched in the gut. Before he could say anything, Aiden turned and ran down the hall, leaving Richard standing there, feeling more lost than ever. The days that followed were painfully quiet. Maria had gone back to her old neighborhood, trying to rebuild the life she had before the Blackwells. But nothing felt right. She missed Aiden's laughter. She missed the way Richard looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. And Richard, he was a shell of himself. He buried himself in work, avoiding the empty feeling in his chest. But Aiden wasn't coping well that he refused to practice his dancing. He barely spoke to his father. And when the night of the big recital arrived, he stood backstage, staring at his shoes, refusing to go on. I can't do it, Aiden muttered, his voice flat. Richard crouched beside him. Aiden, you've worked so hard for this. Aiden shook his head. It doesn't matter. Maria's not here. Richard's throat tightened. This was his fault. He had thought pushing Maria away would protect his son. Instead, he had only hurt him. And in that moment, Richard knew what he had to do. Maria sat alone in her tiny apartment, scrolling through her phone, trying to distract herself from the ache in her heart. Then a notification popped up, a live video. She almost ignored it, but then she saw the name of the event. Aiden Blackwell's recital. Her chest tightened. With trembling fingers, she clicked on it. The screen showed the grand auditorium, packed with people. Aiden stood on stage, looking lost and defeated. And then the camera panned. To Richard, he walked onto the stage, microphone in hand. Maria's breath caught. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard said, his voice strong, unwavering. Before this recital begins, I have something important to say. The crowd murmured. Richard took a deep breath. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. The audience fell silent. I let someone go because I was afraid of what people would say, afraid of losing control. But in doing that, I lost something even more important. His voice softened. I lost the woman I love. Maria's heart pounded. Richard continued, his eyes filled with raw emotion. Maria, if you're watching this, I love you. And I don't care what anyone thinks. Come back, please. Tears streamed down Maria's face. And in that moment, she knew she couldn't stay away. Maria burst into the auditorium just as Aiden was about to leave the stage. Aiden, she called. He turned, his eyes widening in shock. Maria? She ran to him, scooping him into a tight hug. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere. Aiden's face lit up. You came back. She smiled through her tears. I never really left. And then she looked up. Richard was standing there, waiting, heart pounding. Maria stepped toward him. You really meant all that? Richard cupped her face gently. Every word. And then, in front of the entire audience, he kissed her. The crowd erupted in applause. Aiden beamed. And for the first time in a long time, everything felt right, because love Real love was worth fighting for.